Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you forgot which side you were fighting for? It was 1943, and the world was burning. Empires were crumbling, borders were bleeding, and truth was a language no one could afford to speak. But in the middle of this chaos, in a small cafe hidden beneath the bombed ruins of Lyon, a young woman named Elise Durrett stirred a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the secret folded inside the silk ribbon around her wrist. To anyone watching, she was just another waitress, another quiet face among the weary, hollow-eyed survivors of a war that devoured everything. But that wasn't who she really was. Elise was a courier for the French resistance, a messenger carrying coded notes, smuggled blueprints, and names that could topple an army or condemn an entire village. She had learned early that in this war, loyalty was more valuable than gold and twice as dangerous. The cafe was her cover. Soldiers came and went, boots thudding across cracked tiles, laughter echoing against bullet-pocked walls. They didn't notice the way she lingered near their tables, the way her eyes flicked to the insignias on their uniforms. They didn't see the tiny slips of paper she passed between coffee cups or the faint tremor in her breath whenever a German officer ordered her to pour another drink. But that morning, the morning everything changed, a stranger walked in. He wasn't in uniform. His coat was dark, his hair slicked back, and when he removed his gloves, Elise noticed the faint scar across his palm, a jagged line, like a lightning bolt trapped beneath his skin. He sat near the window, ordered nothing, and simply watched her. Not the way soldiers did with hunger or cruelty, but with the unsettling calm of a man who already knew her secrets. When their eyes met, something inside her froze. Later, she would tell herself that moment was fate, that the universe, in all its chaos, had paused just long enough for her to meet the one man who would both save and destroy her. His name was Anton Reinhardt, an intelligence officer, a German spy, and the man who would make her question everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the war she thought she understood. At first, Anton was just a shadow in her world, a face that reappeared too often to be coincidence. He came to the cafe on Thursdays, always sitting at the same table, always ordering the same drink, black coffee, untouched. He would read a newspaper in silence, eyes flicking toward her whenever she passed, and each time Elise felt something she didn't want to name, not fear, but something far more dangerous, curiosity. Weeks went by. Outside, the war roared louder, planes screamed across the sky, sirens wailed in the distance, and each night the resistance lost another name to the Gestapo's list. But inside that cafe, time seemed to hold its breath. There was only her and the man by the window, both pretending not to notice the invisible thread tightening between them. One night, after closing, she found a folded napkin beneath his empty cup. No name, no address, just a single line, written in neat, German script. "You're not as invisible as you think." Her first instinct was to run, to vanish into the labyrinth of back alleys, burn every note she carried, and never look back. But something made her stay that night. She didn't sleep. The rain tapped softly against her window, a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. She stared at the napkin until dawn broke through the fog, wondering if it was a warning or an invitation. 2 days later, she found another note, this time slipped between the pages of a supply ledger. "Meet me at the bridge after dark." The bridge was forbidden after curfew. Guards patrolled both ends, and anyone found there risked a bullet. But Elise went anyway. The night was silent except for the whisper of the river below. She stood by the railing, her breath forming ghosts in the cold air. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Anton appeared from the shadows, his coat collar turned up against the wind. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the river, endless, indifferent. "You know who I am," he said finally. "Yes." "Then why did you come?" Elise hesitated. "Because you left me no choice." He smiled, not the cruel smile of an enemy, but something sadder, almost human. "Good," he said, "because now neither do I." What followed was not a negotiation, not really. It was more like two chess players meeting in the middle of a battlefield, both aware that the wrong move could destroy them. Anton told her he had information, names of resistance members marked for arrest. He wanted her help to pass them warnings before it was too late. She didn't believe him, not at first. But then, 2 of those names disappeared the next day, gone, arrested, executed. And she realized the game had already begun. For months, they played it in silence. Secret exchanges at dawn, coded messages hidden in plain sight, stolen glances that said everything words could not. He would risk his position to pass her documents, and she would risk her life to deliver them. Somewhere between those risks, something changed. She began to wait for him, to listen for his footsteps outside the cafe, to look for the shadow in the crowd that meant he was near. And one night, when the bombs fell closer than ever before, they found themselves in the same basement, hiding from the same storm. The air was thick with dust and fear. Candles flickered weakly in the dark. Elise could hear her own heartbeat, frantic, uneven, as Anton sat across from her, the flicker of flame painting sharp lines across his face. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should you." For a moment, the world above seemed to fade. The war, the lies, the danger. There was only the small, trembling space between them. And then, without warning, he reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek. That was the first time he touched her, the night they fell in love. But love, in wartime, is never gentle. It is a fire that burns without mercy, a secret that lives only in the shadows, because daylight would destroy it. They met in stolen hours, behind shuttered doors, beneath the endless echo of sirens. Their world was built from whispers, the brush of his hand as he passed her a coded note, the taste of his breath when he said her name like a prayer he had no right to say. She told herself it was temporary, that she could keep her heart separate from her mission. But love has a way of blurring the lines between what we fight for and what we surrender to. And soon, Elise wasn't sure which side she was on anymore. Because Anton wasn't the only one hiding something in the heart of the resistance. Her handler, a man known only as Le Renard, had begun to suspect her. Messages were intercepted. Operations failed. Too many coincidences, too many close calls. And every time she looked into Anton's eyes, she wondered if he'd already betrayed her or if she was betraying herself. Then came the night of the ambush. The resistance had planned to sabotage a German convoy, a strike that could cripple the occupation in Lyon. Elise was the messenger, carrying the coordinates in a coded letter sewn into her dress. But halfway through the route, she saw Anton waiting for her by the old station gate. He looked different that night. His eyes were sharp, his voice urgent. "You can't go," he said. "They know. The Gestapo will be there. You'll walk into a trap." She froze. The air between them turned electric, one heartbeat, one breath away from disaster. "How do you know?" she whispered. He didn't answer, and that was when she understood he was the leak. The reason her people were dying. The reason the enemy was always one step ahead. Her hand went to the hidden pistol at her waist, but before she could draw it, Anton said softly, "If you die tonight, everything we tried to do dies with you." Something in his voice, raw, desperate, made her hesitate. "Why?" she asked. "Why warn me?" "Because," he said, "somewhere along the way, I stopped caring who wins." The sirens began to wail again. The world blurred in red and smoke, and in that chaos, she made a choice that would change the course of both their lives. She didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she ran, and when she looked back, Anton was gone, swallowed by the fog, leaving nothing but the sound of boots echoing through the empty station. In the days that followed, Elise's name vanished from the resistance network. Some said she was captured, others said she fled the city. But the truth was far more complicated, because somewhere, in a safe house miles from Lyon, a woman sat by a dying fire, tracing the scar on her wrist where a silk ribbon used to be, and wondering if love could ever truly be innocent when born in the heart of war. Outside, the wind howled like the ghosts of 1,000 lost promises, and in that sound, she thought she heard a voice she once knew, a voice that whispered, almost tenderly, "The game isn't over yet." Then, silence, only the crackle of the fire, and the faint scent of smoke on the wind, carrying with it the question that would haunt her forever. Was she ever really the pawn, or had she been the one moving the pieces all along? Snow had begun to fall over the countryside, soft and soundless, as if the world itself wanted to bury its sins beneath a clean white silence. Elise watched it from the window of the safe house, her breath fogging the glass, her reflection a ghost of the woman she once was. The ribbon that once held her secret messages was gone. So was the cafe, the city, the people she'd risked everything for. And somewhere out there, in the wreckage of a war without mercy, was Anton, the man who'd lied to her, the man who'd saved her, the man she still couldn't stop loving. Days turned into weeks. She lived in the rhythm of survival, wake before dawn, move before patrols, hide before questions. The resistance had gone underground, scattering into fragments of memory and rumor. Sometimes she would hear whispers of raids, of towns burned for defiance, of names spoken in fear. But Anton's name never appeared on any list. It was as if he had vanished from history itself. Until one morning, in the hollow quiet between dreams and waking, a knock came at her door. 3 short taps, one long, the old signal. She froze. No one should have known she was here. When she opened the door, a thin man in a tattered coat stood there, his eyes sunken but sharp. He said nothing, only handed her a small envelope sealed with wax. She recognized the emblem, the fox Le Renard's mark, her handler. Inside was a single line, written in code, "Return to Lyon. The chessboard has changed." Her heart stopped. Lyon, the city she swore she'd never see again. That night she packed what little she had and set out under the cover of darkness. The roads were quiet, the villages hollowed by fear. Every shadow felt like a memory waiting to be remembered. When she finally reached Lyon, it was no longer the city she knew. The streets she once walked barefoot as a child were now lined with soldiers. The cafe was gone, replaced by rubble and silence. But beneath the surface, in the damp tunnels where whispers still carried, the resistance breathed again. Smaller, harder, more ruthless. Le Renard was waiting for her there, in a candlelit cellar that smelled of smoke and gun oil. His face was older, his voice colder. "You should have stayed gone," he said. "You're lucky you're not on my list." Elise met his gaze. "You sent for me." He studied her a moment, then slid a photograph across the table. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but the face was unmistakable. Anton, alive, and wearing a different uniform. He's not with the Germans anymore, Renard said. British intelligence, they call him a defector. He's working with them now. But I don't trust him. I want you to find out why. Elise stared at the photograph. The man in it looked older, sharper, harder, but the eyes were the same. The eyes that once watched her across a cafe window, that once held both danger and something like mercy. Why me? She asked. Renard leaned back, exhaling smoke. Because he'll trust you, because love makes fools of us all. The mission was simple on paper. Locate Anton Reinhardt, verify his allegiance, and if necessary, remove him. But nothing about it felt simple. Not anymore. She found him 2 nights later, in the ruins of a train yard on the city's edge. The air smelled of metal and frost. Anton stood alone beneath the broken arch of a bridge, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. When he saw her, he didn't move, didn't speak. The cigarette fell from his hand and hissed out in the snow. At least, her name on his lips was both a wound and a memory. You're alive, she said quietly. I could say the same, he answered. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind howling through the empty replicas. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying since the night she ran. Why did you betray us? He didn't look away. Because I had to survive long enough to stop something worse. It wasn't an answer. Not yet. But there was something in his voice, exhaustion, regret, maybe even truth. He told her about a file, something he'd stolen from the German High Command before defecting. A plan known only by its codename, Eclipse. It wasn't just a military operation. It was a purge. Thousands of civilians marked for execution in retribution for the resistance movement. Entire towns wiped from existence. I couldn't stop it from inside, he said, so I ran. I've been trying to get the file to the Allies, but someone inside your network has been hunting me ever since. Elise's pulse quickened. You expect me to believe that? No, he said simply. I expect you to remember who I was when I warned you, when I saved you. The truth was, she did remember. Every moment, every lie, every kindness, the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone she couldn't drop. They met again, in secret, moving between safe houses and back alleys. Each meeting was a balance between trust and suspicion, between the past they couldn't escape and the future they couldn't define. But as she followed him deeper into the labyrinth of his plan, she began to see what he'd become. Anton wasn't the same man from the cafe. War had stripped him of certainty, of country, of purpose. He was a ghost moving between sides, guided only by a fragile belief that maybe, somehow, he could undo the damage he'd helped create. One night, as they sheltered in an abandoned chapel, Elise found him sitting alone beneath a shattered stained glass window. Moonlight painted shards of red and blue across his face. Do you ever think about what comes after? She asked. He looked up slowly. After what? The war, the lies, all of this. Anton smiled faintly. There's no after for people like us, Elise. We were created by the war. When it ends, so do we. Something in her heart twisted. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't, because part of her knew he was right. Still, they continued. They found fragments of Eclipse, orders burned but not erased, names smuggled through coded transmissions, and with each discovery, the circle tightened. Someone was always one step ahead. Then came the night at the river crossing. They'd arranged to meet a contact, a man who claimed to have the final piece of the plan. But when Elise arrived, the bridge was empty except for a single lantern swaying in the wind. Anton appeared moments later, his breath visible in the cold air. Something's wrong, he said. Before she could answer, the sound of boots echoed from the shadows. Dozens of them. German soldiers, rifles raised. Run, Anton hissed. But there was nowhere to run. Floodlights burst to life, blinding them. And in that instant Elise saw the figure leading the soldiers, Renard. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. I warned you, Elise, he said. Love makes fools of us all. Betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. She understood then the mission was never about finding Anton. It was about drawing him out, about using her as bait. Eclipse was real, Anton shouted. He's working to protect it. Renard smiled faintly. You always were a clever man, Reinhardt. Pity you're on the wrong side of history. Gunfire erupted. Chaos swallowed the night. Elise stuck behind a broken column, heart hammering as bullets tore through the air. Anton returned fire, shouting her name. Somewhere in the noise, a single scream split the darkness. When it was over, the soldiers were gone. So was Renard, and Anton lay in the snow, his hand pressed against his side, blood seeping through his coat. Elise dropped to her knees beside him. Stay with me, please, he smiled weakly. You always did. Break all the rules. Don't, she whispered. Don't say goodbye. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal case. Inside was a roll of microfilm, the Eclipse file. Take it, he said. End it. She shook her head. Not without you. Promise me, he murmured. Promise you'll finish what we started. Then his hand went still. The world seemed to stop, the wind, the river, even time itself. Elise pressed her forehead against his and whispered something only the dead could hear. By dawn, she was gone. The bridge was empty again, except for a trail of blood leading toward the city. Weeks later, whispers began to spread through the underground. The Eclipse file had reached London. The Allied forces intercepted the operation. Thousands were saved, but Elise Duret's name was never mentioned. Some said she fled to Spain. Others claimed she was captured, that she vanished into the same shadows that had once sheltered her. Yet there were rumors, quiet ones, that a woman with grey eyes and a silk ribbon around her wrist was seen crossing the Swiss border under a false name. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after victory was declared, soldiers swore they heard a song carried on the wind, a French lullaby, half-forgotten, sung by a voice that seemed to come from nowhere. They said it sounded like memory itself, fragile, haunting, and achingly alive. And somewhere, in a war that refused to truly end, the question lingered like smoke over a dying fire. If love could change the course of a war, what would it take to forgive the one who made you lose it? The snow kept falling, erasing footsteps, names, borders, everything except the faint, indelible trace of two people who had once believed that even in a world built on lies, love could still be the one truth worth dying for. But the story wasn't over, because in a hidden archive beneath the ruins of Lyon, a new file was discovered, marked with a single word, written in Anton's hand, Elise, and below it, coordinates. Somewhere she had never been, somewhere she was meant to go. The game, it seemed, had one final move left to play. The coordinates led her north. Through the burned fields and silent villages, across borders that no longer meant anything, she traveled by night, hiding among refugees and deserters. The wind biting through her coat, the cold clinging to her like memory. Each step carried her farther from the woman she once was, and closer to something she didn't yet understand. The paper with Anton's handwriting had begun to fade. She traced the ink with her thumb as she walked, afraid that if she looked away for too long it might vanish completely, and with it the last thread connecting her to him. The coordinates pointed to a valley in the Alps, remote, untouched by the war, or perhaps simply forgotten by it. When she reached it 3 days later, the world felt impossibly quiet. Snow-covered peaks rose like silent witnesses around her, and somewhere below, a thin column of smoke rose from a cabin tucked against the mountainside. Elise hesitated. The place looked abandoned, but smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone alive. She tightened her scarf and descended the slope. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and burnt coffee. Dust motes drifted through the slanted light. On the table, beneath a pile of yellowed papers, was a small metal box identical to the one Anton had carried the night he died. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph, a group of people standing in front of a church, their faces half frozen in time. She recognized none of them. But in the corner, almost hidden by shadow, was a child, a little girl with the same eyes as her own. On the back of the photo, a note written in Anton's hand, "Find her before they do." The words made her breath catch. Find who? Who was the girl, and who were they? The fire crackled softly. She turned toward the mantel and froze. Pinned to the wall was a map, dotted with circles, names, and red lines, converging toward one point: Zurich. Each mark was accompanied by initials: Military Intelligence, Allied Axis. It wasn't just a map of cities. It was a map of people, spies, double agents, operatives whose fates had been twisted by the war's invisible hands. And there, drawn in red ink near the center, was her own name. Duret E circled twice. The air seemed to thin around her. Had Anton known she'd come here? Was this his plan all along, to lead her to this place, this secret? Or had someone else left it, waiting for her to find? A floorboard creaked behind her. Elise spun around, pistol raised. The man who stood in the doorway wasn't a soldier. His clothes were worn, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes sharp but wary. "You shouldn't be here," he said in accented French. "This place is not safe. Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, studying her as if she were a memory he couldn't quite place. "You're Elise." Her finger tightened on the trigger. "How do you know my name?" "Because he told me you would come, Anton," she whispered. The man nodded. "He was here, months ago, before the end." Her heart lurched. "He left this," she gestured toward the map. "He left everything," the man said softly, "including a warning." He motioned toward the table. Beneath the papers, Elise found a sealed envelope bearing the insignia of the British Intelligence Service. Inside was a document stamped, classified, and a single sentence scrawled across the top. "The truth is not what you fought for." "What does this mean?" she asked. The man looked at her, something heavy in his expression. "It means the war you thought you were fighting was never the real one." He poured 2 cups of bitter coffee and sat by the fire. Anton was working for them, yes, but not in the way you think. He was part of something larger, a network within both sides. People trying to control what came after the war, to shape it before it even began. Elise stared at the flickering flames. "You're saying he was part of a conspiracy?" "I'm saying," the man replied, "that he tried to stop one." The room seemed to close in around her. She thought of the names on the map, the web of lines connecting enemies and allies alike. It wasn't just a record of war, it was a record of manipulation, of a game that had outlived the battlefield. The man handed her another document. This was Anton's last message before he disappeared. "It's encrypted, but he said only you could unlock it. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was thin, covered in symbols and phrases she didn't recognize. But one word stood out, repeated several times in the margins. Ariadne. She whispered it aloud, and the man nodded. The code name of the operation he uncovered. The one that started long before either of you were born. Her pulse quickened. What kind of operation? He hesitated. A replacement, a new order. After the war there would be no victors, only those who could control the story of what happened. Anton called it a war for the truth itself. Outside, wind howled against the cabin. Snow rattled the window like restless ghosts. Elise felt something shifting inside her, a terrible understanding that everything she had fought for might have been a lie. When she looked up, the man was watching her with quiet intensity. He loved you, you know, he said, but he also feared you, because he believed you were part of it, even if you didn't know. She froze. What do you mean? The man reached into his coat and pulled out another photograph. It was older, faded, but the image was clear. A group of intelligence officers standing beside a cipher machine. And there she was, Elise, unmistakably her, except the picture was dated 2 years before she had ever joined the resistance. Her voice trembled. That's impossible. He handed it to her. Memory can be rewritten, Elise. Documents can be forged, but faces don't lie. The photograph slipped from her hand, fluttering to the floor. For a moment the world tilted. She saw fragments, flashes, faces she couldn't name, voices she didn't recognize. The cafe, the bridge, Anton's blood on her hands. Were they all part of the same game? Was she ever truly free? The man stood. You need to leave. Others will come soon. They know this place exists. But Elise couldn't move. The room spun around her, filled with questions that had no beginning or end. Who are they? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The ones who write history, he said. And they've been watching you since the beginning. Before she could speak again, a flash of light split the window headlights. Engines growled in the distance. The man grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back door. Go, he shouted. Take the documents and run. Bullets shattered the windows. The room erupted in splinters and smoke. Elise stumbled through the snow, clutching the papers to her chest. Behind her the cabin burned, a violent bloom of fire against the white mountains. She ran until her lungs screamed, until the smoke was just a smear of memory behind her. When she finally stopped, she fell to her knees in the snow. The papers were wet, torn, but one page remained intact. The word Ariadne scrawled again and again, circling a single sentence written in Anton's hand. The truth begins where the war ends. That night, she hid in a shepherd's barn. The wind whispered through the cracks, and the world outside felt endless and cruel. She stared at the words until her eyes blurred, then reached into her coat for the photograph of the girl. The child's face stared back at her, innocent and unknowing. She turned it over again, searching for anything she might have missed. This time, she noticed something faint beneath Anton's handwriting, an impression left by another pen, almost invisible in the light. She held it close to the fire, and the heat revealed a second message, hidden in lemon ink. She's yours. Elise felt the world collapse into silence. Her child, daughter she didn't remember. Memories flickered at the edge of her mind. The smell of lavender, the sound of laughter, a lullaby half remembered. Had she forgotten, or had someone made her forget? The question tore through her like glass. Nothing felt certain anymore. Not Anton, not the resistance, not even herself. Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the snow, painting the world in cold gold. Elise rose slowly, her body trembling with exhaustion and revelation. She had thought the war was over, that Anton's death had ended the game, but now she understood. It had only changed the board. Somewhere in Zurich, a network was rebuilding, reshaping the truth, erasing what didn't fit, and somewhere her daughter was alive, hidden within that machinery of silence and lies. Elise folded the documents, tucked the photograph close to her heart, and stepped into the wind. The mountains stretched before her like an open wound, endless and unforgiving. For the first time, she wasn't running from the past, she was chasing it. But as she disappeared into the snow, another figure emerged on the ridge behind her, watching, silent, his face half hidden by shadow. He raised a radio to his lips. She's moving, he said quietly, just like he said she would. Static crackled, followed by a single reply in a calm, measured voice. Good, let her, she's the key. The wind swallowed the words and the figure vanished into the storm, leaving only one truth echoing through the frozen silence. Elise Durrett was never just a pawn. She was the piece the entire game had been built around, and she was about to discover why. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the world glazed in pale light. Elise's boots crunched against the frozen ground as she climbed higher, the wind slicing through her coat, her thoughts louder than the silence around her. Somewhere behind her, the storm had buried the trail, but she could still feel eyes watching, a presence that lingered, invisible yet certain. Each breath stung her throat, each step carried her farther from the woman she had been and closer to a truth that terrified her. She didn't know what waited at the end of this path, only that Anton had led her here for a reason, and that reason was bound to the word she could not escape, Ariadne. The papers she carried had begun to fall apart, edges frayed, ink smudged from melted snow. She stopped beneath a ridge and spread them on a rock, her fingers stiff from the cold. There, hidden beneath layers of encryption, was a sequence of numbers she hadn't noticed before. Coordinates again, this time, leading not to a place but to an institution. The Zurich Asylum for Displaced Children. Her pulse quickened. The photograph of the little girl burned in her pocket. Zurich was days away on foot, but she didn't hesitate. She followed the railway lines, moving by night, stealing warmth from abandoned stations, sleeping beneath broken benches. Along the way, she began to see posters, faces of the missing, notices of reconstruction, promises of peace that felt like lies painted over old wounds, and beneath those posters, sometimes, a small labyrinth drawn in charcoal. She saw it first in a cafe window, then on a train car, then carved into a tree by the side of the road. The mark of Ariadne. By the time she reached the outskirts of Zurich, her body was numb with exhaustion. Smoke from chimneys curled into the pale evening sky. The city looked untouched by war, clean streets, quiet order, people walking as if the past had never happened. But beneath the calm, something felt wrong, too controlled, too careful. The asylum stood on a hill overlooking the city, its windows dark, its gates wrapped in barbed wire. A sign above the entrance read St. Hulvard's Institute for War Orphans. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and iron. Elise waited until dusk before slipping inside through a service gate. The corridors were dimly lit, the floors spotless. She could hear the faint hum of electricity, the rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the building. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness. She moved like a shadow through the halls, her hand brushing against the cold plaster walls. On one door she saw a familiar symbol, the labyrinth etched so faintly it was almost invisible. She pushed it open. The room inside was lined with filing cabinets, hundreds of them, each drawer labeled with a name, a number, a date. The air was heavy with the smell of paper and dust. She opened the nearest drawer and froze. Inside were photographs of children, each one accompanied by documents, fingerprints, blood type, psychological assessments, not orphans, experiments. She pulled another file, then another, each one the same names erased, replaced with initials. And in one of the folders, under subject A37, she found a photograph that made her blood run cold. The girl again, the same face, same eyes. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Anton, alive, not in uniform, not in chains. Standing tall, expression calm, a hand resting on the child's shoulder as though he were her guardian. Elise's breath hitched. She traced the photograph with trembling fingers. There was something written beneath it in German. Phase 3 approved. Memory sequence successful. Her stomach twisted. Memory sequence. The phrase burned through her thoughts. The photograph she had seen earlier, the one from years before she joined the resistance, came rushing back. The missing years. The gaps she had never been able to explain. She realized then that Anton hadn't just discovered Ariadne. He had been part of it. The room seemed to tilt. The silence around her grew sharp, almost alive. Then footsteps. She slammed the drawer shut and turned. A woman stood in the doorway, wearing a gray coat and gloves, her hair pinned neatly. Her voice was soft, polite, to calm. "You shouldn't be here." Elise raised her gun. "Who are you?" The woman smiled faintly. "Someone who's been expecting you. I'm not here to play games. But that's what this has always been, hasn't it?" The woman stepped closer. Her eyes were pale, unblinking. "You and Anton, the perfect test subjects. Love makes for such interesting data." Elise's hand trembled. "What are you talking about?" The woman nodded toward the files. "You were part of Ariadne, long before the war began. The program wasn't about weapons, Elise. It was about control, how to build loyalty, how to erase it, how to make someone believe in something so completely they'd die for it." "That's a lie." The woman tilted her head. "Is it? Tell me, when did you first meet Anton? Do you remember what year? The cafe in Lyon, wasn't it? Or was it Berlin? Or Prague?" Elise's breath caught. Images flickered behind her eyes. The cafe, the bridge, the basement, the river, but they blurred, overlapped, became indistinct. "What did you do to me?" The woman's smile faded. "We gave you purpose. You and Anton both. You were meant to test the limits of loyalty. The file you carried, the missions, the betrayal, all of it designed to see what love could override." Elise's gun lowered slightly. He knew at first no, then he began to remember. "That's why he ran. He tried to save you from yourself." The words felt like a physical blow. Elise took a step back. "Where is the girl?" The woman's eyes softened. "She's safe, but she's not your daughter, Elise. She's your beginning, your first replication." For a moment, the world was silent. Only the sound of the clock echoed through the hall. Elise shook her head, her pulse pounding. "No, that's not possible. Isn't it? You've seen the evidence. Your memories were designed, rewritten, reused. You are the prototype of Ariadne, a human blueprint for emotional reconditioning." Elise stumbled against the table. The room spun, her thoughts breaking apart. The war, Anton, the resistance, had any of it been real? The woman reached into her coat and pulled out a small device, metal and glass, humming faintly. "You were meant to be decommissioned when the war ended, but Anton refused. He believed you could choose something real. He thought love could rewrite the code." Elise's voice was barely a whisper, and did it. The woman's eyes flickered. "We're about to find out." Before Elise could react, a sudden burst of light filled the room, a high-pitched whine that pierced through her skull. She dropped to her knees, the gun clattering from her hand. Images flashed behind her eyes: Anton's face, the cafe, the bridge, the fire, the girl's laughter, her own voice repeating words she didn't remember speaking. When the light faded, the woman was gone. The files lay scattered around her, the photographs curling from the heat of a small, dying spark. The room smelled faintly of ozone and burnt paper. Elise forced herself to her feet, the edges of her vision blurred, her heartbeat echoing like a drum. On the wall, beneath the peeling paint, something new had appeared, a message, written in Anton's handwriting: "Trust no one, not even yourself." Her hands shook as she traced the letters. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her memory shifted, a lock turning in the dark. She saw Anton again, but not as she remembered him. He was standing in a sterile room, wearing a lab coat, watching her through glass. His expression wasn't love, it was guilt. She gasped and stumbled back. The pieces no longer fit, but they were beginning to show their shape. Anton hadn't betrayed her, he had created her. The truth pressed down on her, too vast to hold. She looked again at the photograph of the girl, the same eyes, the same scar on the wrist. Not a daughter, a version, a continuation. And suddenly, she wasn't sure who Elise Durrett really was. Outside, the faint sound of sirens rose from the valley. Searchlights swept the hills, growing brighter, closer. She grabbed the remaining files, stuffed them into her coat, and slipped out the back door, into the freezing night. The asylum loomed behind her, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere inside, the truth was still buried in machines, in memories, in ghosts that refused to die. She ran through the forest, the branches clawing at her clothes, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Every heartbeat echoed with Anton's voice, his final words: "The truth begins where the war ends." But as she reached the edge of the woods, she saw something that made her stop, a car parked beneath the trees. Its headlights off, engine idling softly, and inside a silhouette she recognized instantly. Anton, alive. Her breath caught. For a moment, time seemed to fold. The snow, the cold, the fear all vanished. Only his face, half lit by the dashboard light, watching her through the windshield. He raised a hand, motioning her closer. Elise took one step, then another, her pulse trembling in her ears. But something in his eyes, calm, almost too calm, made her hesitate. The door opened, and as she stood frozen in the dark, torn between memory and reality, she felt the storm finally gather around her, every secret, every lie, every ghost of love collapsing into a single, silent moment before the world changed forever. The wind carried his voice to her, quiet and steady. "Elise," he said, "it's time you knew everything." Then the headlights fled to life, flooding the forest in white, and she realized too late, she wasn't the only one he had been waiting for. The light swallowed everything. For a heartbeat, Elise couldn't see, only a blinding white that burned the edges of her vision. The forest erased, time suspended. Then shapes began to emerge. The car, the trees, Anton stepping out into the snow. He looked the same, yet not. His hair was longer, his face hollowed by years, but his eyes, those same gray eyes, still held that impossible calm, that quiet pull between danger and tenderness. "Elise," he said softly, his breath turned to mist between them. "You shouldn't have come here." She stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her throat. "You're alive." He nodded once. "Alive, yes. Free, no." The words hung between them like fog. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do it? Why the lies, the memories?" He took a slow step toward her, the snow crunching under his boots. Because the world needed something to believe in when the war ended. They wanted proof that devotion could be engineered, that love could be manufactured as easily as fear. Her hands shook. "And you gave them me." Anton's gaze wavered, a flicker of guilt breaking through the calm. "You were never meant to know. They wanted you to die with the rest of the program. But I couldn't. You were." He stopped himself. "You were the only part of it that felt real." She laughed, sharp and hollow. "Real. You built me. You erased me. You turned me into an experiment." "Yes," he said. "And you defied it. Every test, every parameter, every prediction, you broke them all. You fell in love, Elise. You chose it. That's something they couldn't control." The wind moaned through the pines. Snow drifted between them like ash. "Why bring me here?" she asked. "Why not let me stay buried?" Anton looked past her toward the asylum where distant sirens still echoed. "Because they're not done. Ariadne didn't end it, evolved, and now they're using it again. New faces, new subjects. That child you saw, she's not just your reflection. She's the next phase." Elise's chest tightened. "Where is she?" "She's here," he said quietly, "in Zurich. They've hidden her in plain sight, under a new name. If they finish what they started, there won't be any difference between truth and fiction anymore." She stepped closer, snow soaking through her boots. "Then help me stop them." He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the forest behind her. "You're being followed." Elise turned, gun raised, but the woods was still only the faint hum of an engine in the distance. Anton's voice dropped lower. "They've been tracking you since Lion. Every move, every message, even this meeting. She faced him again, fury and disbelief twisting together. Then why come? Why lead me here? Because, he said, you're the only one they can't predict anymore. Something cracked in the air, not sound, not sight, but a feeling, sharp and electric, like the world about to split. Anton's face changed, a shadow passing through it. He glanced over her shoulder. Run. A flash tore through the trees. The hiss of a bullet, the thud of impact. Anton staggered, clutching his side. No, Elise screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood bloomed across his coat, dark and vivid against the snow. He tried to speak, but coughed instead, his breath shuddering. Elise, he whispered, his voice thin. Listen to me. The girl. She's in the central archives, beneath the asylum. There's a machine, the core of Ariadne. Destroy it. She gripped his hand. I'm not leaving you. His eyes softened, filled with something almost peaceful. You already did, once. He pressed something into her palm, a small glass capsule, glinting faintly. This will unlock the core, promise me. The rest dissolved into breath and silence. Elise held him, felt the life slip away beneath her hands. The snow around them glowed faintly red, as if the world itself was remembering the cost of its secrets. For a long time, she didn't move, only the sound of the wind and the slow cooling of his body. When she finally stood, her heart felt carved hollow, grief and fury fused into something colder, sharper. She closed his eyes, took the capsule, and turned toward the hill. The asylum's dark outline loomed against the horizon, windows like watchful eyes waiting. She walked without looking back. Inside, the corridors were empty now, abandoned in haste. The hum of machinery echoed faintly through the walls. She followed it downward stair after stair, hallway after hallway, until the air grew colder, metallic. At the end of a long tunnel stood a steel door. She pressed her ear to it. A steady pulse vibrated beneath. Rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. She inserted the capsule into the panel. The door hissed open. The chamber beyond glowed with pale blue light. Tubes, cables, glass tanks filled with liquid, and within one floating suspended the girl. The same child from the photograph, from the files. Eyes closed, hands folded over her chest as if asleep. Elise stepped closer, her reflection merging with the child's. For a moment, it was like looking into a mirror across time. Herself, reborn, erased, repeated. A voice echoed behind her. I told you, you'd come. The woman in the gray coat stood in the doorway. Composed, a gun in her hand. You shouldn't have opened it. Elise didn't turn. What is she? She's what you were meant to be, the woman said. Perfect devotion, perfect control. You were the prototype. She's the completion. Elise stared at the child, at the bubbles rising through the liquid. You're playing God. No, the woman replied. We're preserving humanity. You've seen what chaos does, what choice costs. Ariadne will ensure peace, the kind built on absolute faith. Elise turned, her voice trembling. Faith in what? Lies. In certainty, the woman said. The world doesn't need truth, it needs order. For a heartbeat neither moved. The hum of the machine filled the air, deep and endless. Elise's eyes flicked to the control console beside the tank, a switch marked purge. She took a slow breath. Then you've already lost. The woman raised her gun. Don't. Elise's hand hovered over the switch. You can erase memory, rewrite hearts, build perfect obedience, but you can't erase love, not the real kind. Love, the woman said coldly, is the reason the world burns. Maybe, Elise whispered, but it's also the reason it survives. She slammed the switch. The alarms screamed to life. The tanks erupted in blinding light. The woman fired. The shot tore through Elise's shoulder, spinning her to the ground, but Elise's hand found the next lever, pulling it down with all her strength. Glass shattered. Water poured out in torrents. The girl inside fell forward into Elise's arms, gasping, alive. The woman staggered back, covering her face from the light. You fool, you'll destroy everything. Elise pressed her hand to the child's back, whispering through the chaos. It was never yours to control. The machine sparked, one after another, a chain reaction of collapse. The walls trembled, the air filled with heat and smoke. Elise pulled the girl to her feet. Come on. They ran through the corridor as the facility began to implode, alarms blaring, steel groaning. The woman's voice echoed behind them, half fury, half fear. You can't escape what you are. Elise didn't look back. By the time they reached the surface, dawn had broken. The asylum stood burning against the horizon, its towers collapsing in slow motion. A monument to every lie the world had tried to build. Elise fell to her knees, clutching her wound, the child beside her trembling and silent. Smoke rose in thin spirals around them. The girl looked up at her, the same gray eyes, the same faint scar on her wrist. Elise brushed the child's hair from her face. What's your name? The girl hesitated, then whispered Elise. For a moment, neither spoke. The name hung between them like a reflection of something infinite. Elise's chest ached, not from pain, but from understanding. Anton had never wanted to save her life. He had wanted to give her a choice, one no one else in Ariadne had ever been given, to choose who she was. The girl's hand found hers. Small, warm, real. Far behind them, the asylum's final explosion rippled across the valley, a bloom of fire, then silence. Snow began to fall again, soft and forgiving, erasing footprints, smoke, blood. Elise closed her eyes, her breath trembling. For the first time there was no noise, no orders, no memories echoing that weren't her own, only the present, only the heartbeat of a child who shared her name. She looked toward the horizon where the sun rose through the smoke, painting the world gold. Somewhere in that light, she thought she could almost see Anton standing still, just beyond the reach of time, watching as the world he had helped create finally came undone. She whispered his name, not in anger, not in grief, but in quiet gratitude. Then she stood, holding the girl's hand, and walked into the light of the new day, the world before her uncertain, fragile, but finally her own. Behind her, the last tower of St. Halvard's crumbled into ash, and with it, the last whisper of Ariadne. And though the snow kept falling, covering the scars of everything that had come before, the story of Elise Durrett, the woman who had been built to obey but learned to love, lived on. A story no one had written, a story no one could erase. The morning after the fire was quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the fragile, breathless stillness of something trying to remember how to exist. Smoke still drifted from the ruins on the hill, rising like slow, grey ghosts. Elise and the girl sat by the edge of a frozen lake, their reflections rippling whenever the wind passed. The world around them looked untouched, yet everything had changed. The war, the lies, the walls of the asylum, all reduced to ashes. But the silence left behind wasn't empty. It was heavy with possibility, the kind that comes when the past finally loosens its grip. The girl, the child who carried her name, was wrapped in Anton's old coat, the one Elise had taken from the car. It hung too large on her, sleeves swallowing her hands, but she didn't complain. She just sat beside Elise, her breath clouding the cold air, eyes following the smoke curling into the pale sky. "Is it over?" she asked. Elise looked at her reflection in the ice. The woman staring back looked older now, worn but real. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Maybe things like this don't end. Maybe they just stop mattering." The girl tilted her head. "But we're free now, right? Freedom." The word lingered between them, both fragile and enormous. Elise thought of all the times she had believed herself free during the resistance. The escapes, even the lies that felt like truth. Freedom had always been a story someone else told her. Maybe it wasn't something you found, she thought. Maybe it was something you finally stopped running from. She stood slowly, the snow crunching beneath her boots. "Come on," she said softly. "There's a village not far from here. We'll find food, warmth." The girl hesitated, eyes on the hill where the asylum's blackened skeleton stood against the grey sky. What if they come back? Elise followed her gaze. The ruins looked smaller from this distance, almost peaceful. Then they'll find nothing left to control. They walked for hours, the sound of their steps blending with the wind. The road wound through quiet fields and frozen streams, each step carrying them farther from the life Elise had been built to live. Every so often the girl would ask questions about the world, about before, about what came next, and Elise would answer what she could. When she couldn't, she would simply say, "We'll find out together." By the time they reached the village, the sun was sinking. The streets were lined with shuttered houses and half-mended fences. Life had returned here in fragments. A baker sweeping his doorstep, a woman hanging laundry in the cold, a boy kicking a dented tin can down an alley. People looked up as Elise and the girl passed, not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity of those who had seen too much to judge anyone anymore. They found a small inn near the square. The owner, an old woman with kind eyes, took them in without questions. She led them upstairs, gave them blankets, bread, and a pot of tea that smelled faintly of cinnamon. That night, for the first time in years, Elise slept without dreams. When she awoke, the world outside the window had turned silver with frost. The girl was still asleep, curled beneath a quilt, breathing softly. Elise sat by the window, watching the light grow. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, gentle, human, ordinary. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out what remained of Anton's capsule. The glass had cracked in the explosion. The inner mechanism fused into silence. She turned it over in her hand, the last piece of a world built on control. Anton's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "You were meant to test the limits of loyalty, but love," she realized, had never been a test. It was the failure of the experiment, the one variable they couldn't predict, the one thing that refused to be programmed. She wondered, briefly, what Anton had felt in those final moments. Not fear perhaps, but relief. The kind of peace that comes from letting go of what you created, even if it means losing it. The girl stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Are we leaving?" "Not yet," Elise said, smiling faintly. "We have time." They spent the next few days in the village. Elise helped mend fences, fetched water, learned the names of people who spoke with quiet resilience. The girl played with the local children, laughing in bursts that startled Elise at first, then soothed her. Each sound felt like proof that the world, despite everything, could begin again. One evening, the sky flamed with orange and violet as the sun set behind the hills. Elise and the girl sat on the church steps, watching the light fade. "Do you think he's gone?" the girl asked. Elise looked up at the horizon. "Anton," the girl nodded. Elise thought for a long time. "Maybe not," she said finally. Some people don't leave, they just change shape. The girl rested her head on Elise's shoulder. He was good, wasn't he? Elise smiled faintly. He tried to be. That counts for something. They sat in silence until the bells began to toll again, slow and soft. Elise watched the clouds drift, thinking of how strange it was that love, something she had once believed was manufactured, could feel more real now than anything that had come before. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't safe, but it was alive. That night she walked alone down the narrow road leading out of the village. The moon hung low, lighting the snow-covered path ahead. She thought of the girl asleep back at the inn, of Anton's last words, of the ruins fading under the snow. Somewhere deep inside she felt the echo of the question that had haunted her since the beginning. Who was she? A soldier, a creation, a lover, a ghost. But now, standing in the cold quiet of this new world, she realized she didn't need the answer. The question itself was enough. Maybe identity wasn't something given or taken, but something made, moment by moment, choice by choice. She closed her eyes and listened. The wind moved through the trees like the sound of distant water, carrying with it a whisper of memory, laughter, music, the faintest hum of Anton's voice. When she returned to the inn, the girl was awake, waiting by the window. "Where did you go?" she asked. "Nowhere," Elise said, smiling. "Just needed to feel the night." The girl nodded, sleepy but content. "Are we staying here?" For now, Elise knelt beside her. "But someday we'll go farther. There's a whole world out there that doesn't know who we are. Maybe that's a good place to start." The girl smiled, her eyes shining. "Then you can teach me everything." Elise brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe you'll teach me too." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and endless. The wind whispered against the window, but it no longer sounded like ghosts. It sounded like breath, the slow, steady rhythm of life returning. In the days that followed, Elise began writing. Not reports or coded messages, but memories, fragments of her own, real or imagined. It didn't matter. She wrote them on scraps of paper and tucked them into a small notebook she found at the inn. Each page began the same way. For her, sometimes the girl would sit beside her, watching. "Who are you writing to?" Elise would smile. "To the part of me that's still learning how to be human." As winter deepened, the snow covered what was left of the asylum entirely. The land healed itself quietly, the way it always does, not by forgetting, but by continuing. On the first day of spring, Elise and the girl left the village. They walked along a dirt road bordered by new grass, the air filled with birdsong. The world was softer now, the colors gentler. When they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, Elise stopped. From there, she could see the faint line of smoke rising where the ruins once were. She took a deep breath and let it go. The girl looked up at her. "What happens now?" Elise smiled. "We live." They walked on. Two shadows stretched long against the gold of morning. For a moment, the wind carried the scent of lilac, and Elise felt something inside her lift. Not hope, exactly, but something close. She thought of all the lives that had been shaped by control, by fear, by the illusion of choice. She thought of Anton, of the faces in the files, of the little girl who wasn't just her reflection but her redemption. Maybe, she thought, love isn't the opposite of control at all. Maybe it's the proof that control never really worked. As they disappeared into the horizon, the light breaking gently through the clouds, the question hung in the air, quiet, eternal. If every memory can be rewritten, what remains truly ours? And the answer, though small and fleeting, was there in the rhythm of their footsteps, in the hand she held, in the fragile warmth of a world beginning again. Somewhere beyond the hills, a new day waited. And for the first time, Elise Durrett walked toward it, not as a creation, not as a pawn, but as a person who had chosen to exist. And that, she thought, was the truest freedom of all.